Hi, I'm Don Rooney.
And I'm John Timpane. Don spent his entire career in radio and television broadcasting.
And John's an author, an editor, and newspaper features writer who spent many years as the editorial page editor of the Philadelphia Inquirer.
We had a radio show in college, and on one show we introduced a soothing musical interlude.
But we stumbled, and it came out Musical Innertube.
And that became the name for this podcast, where we talk with interesting people about their interesting lives.
And today we're talking with Carl Parker. Carl is a meteorologist with the Weather Channel down in Atlanta. How you doing today, Carl?
Doing very well. Thanks for having me.
Carl, we want to get you to talk about the hurricane season, which we're just starting to get into the thick of it. But before we get there, we want to talk about what's happening right now, and that is we've got heat and drought and forest fires in the West. Through the rest of America, we have heat and flooding. In Europe, we have heat and flooding. So I know you're a scientist and not a religious person, but is this the apocalypse?
Well, these are all things that scientists have understood for a very, very long time, that the weather would be amplified in many regards, that hotter periods would get hotter, that drier periods would get drier, and that wetter weather would get even wetter. And so, what's happening broadly is obviously it's getting warmer. I mean, that's, the simplest part of it. But then there are other things that are going on too. One is that weather patterns may actually be changing to the point where they become a little more fixed. And we've seen this sort of what we call ridging developing over the West, where weather, doesn't come in. I mean, in general, in the summertime, you don't get any weather across most of the West. But even beyond that, during the months when we typically see storms coming in from the Pacific, we're seeing less of that most recently. And another part of this is evaporation. So when it's warmer, you're going to evaporate more moisture from the surface of the earth. When that happens over the oceans hold 97% of Earth's water. So that is going to put a lot more moisture in the air. And when that gets funneled into storm systems, that increases the chance of very heavy rain. Now, in general, the atmosphere is about 7% more moisture for every 1 degree Celsius of warming. But you can get a lot more than that when you have extreme events, especially when events slow down. And that's part of what I was mentioning before. We're having a slowing of weather systems going on. Then when you look at what happens in the West, only about 1/100th of 1% of Earth's water is in soils. So it doesn't take very much to get rid of that water when you have really hot, dry periods. And that's precisely what's going on now in the West. We're entering what a lot of scientists feel is a mega drought, a long-lasting, pervasive drought. And they're having terrible problems with water out there. You might have heard that Lake Oroville is down to its lowest level ever.
Yes, I saw the pictures, and it was really, 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 it's just distressing to see Lake Oroville down like that.
Yeah, for the first time in the 50 years that's been around, they're not able to use the generators and power. They have the capacity to power 800,000 homes with those generators, and they can't do that because there's not enough water in that reservoir. And you have similar things going on with Colorado River, where it's such a low level, and 25 million people depend on that water, and it's getting lower all the time, and there are going to be these fights over water, essentially. So there are a lot of different things that are converging right now. And, this is all stuff that the IPCC has been talking about for a long, long time. We've had these reports that have come out, and they've become more and more forceful every time. This last one was very forceful. They said that warming caused by humans is unequivocal. And so we've got all the data. We know what the problems are. And, we really don't need to understand that any better. We just need to start changing things.
Yeah, I guess that last report was the one that said it was a red alert for humanity. For this, series of events, people are kind of getting the idea, climate change is real and it's happening right now. What can we do to reverse the trends? Are we past a breaking point?
Well, the thing at this point is we are going to see a certain amount of warming. It is not at the point at which we can't change things. So what we're talking about is changing the trajectories. Where do you want to end up? And if you look at the latest IPCC report, there's this possibility that, maybe we could end up with 1.5 degrees of warming. That's going to be hard to do. We're at 1.07 right now. And in order to get to 1.5, we would have to really rapidly, substantially reduce our emissions. And it does not appear that we're on a trajectory to do that. So that is probably out. And it's too bad because there was a report that came out just a few years ago that said that the difference between 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming and 2 degrees is really going to be remarkable. So, it looks like 2 degrees is where we're headed. But if we can manage to ramp up all these technologies, maybe we can keep it at 2. If we don't do a thing, then we're talking about maybe 3 or 4 degrees of warming. And that's the point at which, it's all, we can see what's going on with 1.07 degrees of warming. So just imagine what it would be like if it was, that much higher. And that's something that none of us really want to face. Now, the good news is that renewable energy is getting cheaper and cheaper all the time. And so there's a point at which it almost becomes a market-based solution. And it almost doesn't matter what politicians have to say about it, because once it's cheaper to do that, then it's going to go that way anyway. You look at big corporations like Target and Walmart, they're putting solar panels on the roofs of all these big box stores because there's less capital cost, in terms of powering all those stores. In the long run, it saves them money. So once that enters the equation, then I think you start moving pretty quickly. But, of course, you do also need government to pitch in that regard. It is a very large undertaking. A lot of people have compared it to a moonshot, and we need to do it much more quickly. It's great that the markets are doing this, but we need to do it a lot more rapidly than we are.
You see straws in the wind, such as most of the major car companies now have an electric car project, and you would not have seen that 10 years ago.
Right. Yeah. And we have 2 Honda hybrids, and I would never go back to another type of car, and they were not expensive cars. I know that EV cost is a real issue for a lot of consumers, and for good reason. I've even wondered about when I'm going to take that plunge myself. But just having a hybrid and having that experience where, for example, if you're just driving around town doing 25 to 35 miles per hour, a lot of times the engine doesn't even kick in, and so it's this really smooth, really quiet experience. There's not any noise at all when you're at a light. It's a better driving experience. Just based on that alone, I think a lot of people would move in that direction if they were to have a fair amount of experience with this. And but beyond that, it's just wonderful. I fill up every 2 weeks, something like that. For my wife, her car is even better than mine, and maybe even 2.5 weeks for her. And it's just really, really nice to feel like you're doing something. You're moving in that direction. I have a Honda Accord hybrid, and it gets 47. And my wife has a Honda Insight, and it gets 52. And her car's a little smaller than mine, but it used to be that you had to drive a Prius to get mileage like that. And that's what's sort of amazing about hybrids these days is you don't have to drive a very small car to do that. The technology has improved really radically.
Obviously, people will graph this over the next 10 to 20 years, but there's got to be a point at which consumer and business awareness of the cost savings is going to get us to a better place where emissions are concerned. Is that likely to be enough? Is it likely to happen soon enough, do you think?
Well, I think part of the problem is that, we're not sending the right price signals to the market. And there was a study that came out, I believe, just a couple of years ago that showed that the U.S. several years ago probably paid somewhere in the order of $649 billion in 1 year in direct and indirect subsidies to oil and gas. So, some of that is just money that the government is just handing
Right.
oil companies, but some of it is other things like healthcare costs for air pollution and the costs of climate change, things like that. And so if we were to price oil more effectively, then I think you'd see a relatively quick transition. And that's the thing that bothers me when I see, for example, there's always a big local news, hullabaloo when prices go up by 20 cents. we talked to people at the gas station today, and this is what they said. And whenever I see that, I think to myself, what people don't realize is that they are paying much, much more for gas in these indirect ways that nobody ever really thinks about. And so it really ought to be a lot more than it is. And if it was, then we'd see, I think, a relatively quick transition. But of course, there's not a lot of political will to make that happen. If you start talking about, I think they're even floating now a 25-cent per gallon gas tax. And, even that is like a third rail. People don't want to go anywhere near that.
So, what are the indirect costs that we are paying for? Could you enumerate a couple of those?
Yeah, well, I don't have the figures right in front of me, but I know that was a very large part of it. For example, there are millions of people that are killed by air pollution every year. There are people that are sickened by air pollution every year. So that is absolutely an indirect cost. And then when you look at the increasing cost of climate change, when you talk about increasing wildfires and more heavy rain and all of that, if you were to, try to put a price on that, and there's been an effort to do that in recent years, and then, you put that back into how oil and gas is responsible for that, then that's how they arrived at this $649 billion figure. And I think the largest part of that was the indirect part.
If you have somebody who's living out west right now, and they've gone through a hideous spring and summer with temperatures 115, 120 degrees, and then on top of that, fires that were ravaging most of the area. What would you tell them to look forward to as far as living there over the next 5 or 6 years? Are they going to continue to see this? How can we head it off? How can we make things better for them? Or should they just buckle in and expect that this is going to be the way it is for the near future anyway?
It's really tough. What they're going through out there. This is, the whole reason why people settled in the West is because it, had a livable climate. You're experiencing things now that we haven't seen since the West has been settled. For example, scientists cut into these very old trees. They're called bristlecone pine trees, and they're a good 3, 4, 5,000 years old. And by examining the tree rings, they were able to determine that the drought that we saw in 2012 to 2015 in California was likely the worst in 1,200 years. And now we're getting back to a point where we're starting to approach that level of drought again. So, we're forcing the West into a condition that was never the case when people went out there to begin with. So I think it is going to be harder to live out there. I think water is going to be a critical issue. I think another thing that's going to happen is that insurance is going to be a very big problem, in that insurance companies are dropping people that live in the wildland urban interface. Of course, real estate is sky high in California. And so people respond to that by pushing deeper and deeper into the woods. And by doing that, they're more at risk, and insurers, accordingly, just to save their business, are getting to the point where they feel like they're not going to be able to insure everybody. And I think they just lifted the moratorium in California, or it's coming up. I believe they're going to be lifting the moratorium on dropping people. And once more of that happens, well, I think that is actually going to force people to move to different parts of the country.
The East Coast is experiencing its own problems as well. We've had a lot of heat here and a lot of very heavy rains that turned what should have been a typical thunderstorm into a flood situation. And that I assume, using my meteorological skills, is because that warm air holds more moisture. So one of these typical summer storms can turn into a real bad storm really quickly. Is that right?
Yeah, there are several things that are happening in your region in particular. One is, as you mentioned, there's more moisture in the atmosphere, which is about 7% for every 1 degree Celsius. But then another part of what's going on is that we're seeing a slowing of weather systems. And, there's been a lot of conflicting ideas about that. But in a very broad sense, if you're pushing the cold air farther and farther north, It's getting warmer in general. The jet stream is a function of the contrast between warm tropical air and polar air. And the greater the contrast, the stronger the jet stream will be. And the stronger the jet stream is, the faster weather systems move. Well, as we're seeing less contrast, particularly because the Arctic is warming twice as fast as the rest of the planet, we're seeing a much wavier, weaker jet stream. And in that regime, systems tend to slow down even more, and that can cause even more rain. But then another component is urbanization. And we've just seen this mass paving of, well, there's the entire megalopolis, of course, from Washington through Philly, New York, and Boston, and then areas outside of that, like in Harrisburg. And with all of that impervious surface, you get a heavy rainfall, and 90% of what falls on the ground runs off, as opposed to what happens in, a more rural area where there's a lot of forest and a lot of natural ground cover. Well, you might absorb half of that rainfall and the other half runs off. So that too is making it worse. You've got more moisture, you've got slower systems, and then all the pavement causing the flooding to be more severe.
Don and I have lived out here for a couple of decades, and I think even in that comparatively short time, we've seen the climate change. I mean, it's different. Summer is different now from what it was even in the 80s.
Yeah.
Now, maybe it always does in the course of a lifetime, but to have that personal subjective experience where, we have tornadoes around my house. We never had those before. The central Jersey, what's that about,
Yeah.
You combine that with these new changes and the warnings from the UN and the most recent UN report. It's just it's a new emotional landscape as well as scientific.
Absolutely. There's no question about that. I cannot tell you the number of times that the Weather Channel has been at a location where there was a flood or something else like that, or maybe they're talking to farmers. And some version of this idea is what we hear over and over and over and over again. And I've lived here all my life, and I've never seen it like this before. And that's really powerful because, for the longest time, this was such a hot, just such a divisive issue. And, now people's attitudes are changing. And if you look at the research on the Yale 6 Americas, what they're finding is that the group of people that tend to reject all the science is really shrinking. The group of people that are alarmed and concerned is really growing. And a really big part of that is this direct experience. There was a study from the University of Chicago from a few years back, and what they found is that 48% of respondents had changed their mind about climate change within the last 5 years. And they found that of that group, 76%, the largest share, changed their mind because of their personal experience with severe weather or what they had seen happening around them, just knowing that the weather was different than what they were used to. So I think that's very, very powerful. I think that's a big part of what is changing minds. It doesn't really matter how much we say it. If you see it in front of you, well, you're going to be convinced.
As my grandfather used to say, nothing changes your mind like a punch in the face.
Exactly.
So I think we should just sit on that point for just a moment and make sure everybody heard it. So both of our listeners will understand what you're saying here, which is, the thing that changes people's minds is their personal experience. And enough people are now realizing that what they're seeing is real change, that's changing minds.
Absolutely. I mean, you've got people that felt like they never lived on a floodplain, and suddenly they're discovering that they do. I mean, we've seen that all over the place in this area. I mean, we've certainly seen it in areas along the Gulf Coast. The Harvey is one spectacular example of that. Yeah. So when they characterize floods, we've often heard 1 in 100 year flood, a flood that has a 1 in 100 chance of occurring in a given year. Well, a 1 in 1,000 year flood is a huge deal. It's something that's not supposed to occur very often, and it's supposed to happen in a rather limited area. Well, what they found with Harvey was that the 1 in 1,000 year flood covered an area the size of New Jersey that was most of the Houston metro area and then most of southeast Texas over into Beaumont as well. I mean, it was the impact of that flood it's just unbelievable. I think 300,000 cars were flooded out, something like that. It was, by far the most impactful event that we have seen. And all of these people who never would have guessed that they were at risk of flooding suddenly realized that they were in that case. And that, by the way, was something that was related to not just more moisture being in the atmosphere, but also the slowing of weather. The system just stopped, and it would not have been that but for the fact that it just stopped. So yes, I think that is an extraordinarily powerful thing that is occurring in a lot of different ways. We're seeing it in the Pacific Northwest. I mean, you just saw heat that we've never seen there before. I mean, 2/3 of the people in British Columbia don't have air conditioning because they've never needed it. And yet you had a location that got to 121 degrees for a couple of days before it mostly burned in a wildfire. So, these are things that are just, it's getting to the point where it's so in your face that it just seems ridiculous to try to deny what's going on.
And what I like about this is that it takes it out of the realm of the political or the partisan.
Yes.
It's sort of almost like stick your head out your window, Jack.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
exactly.
So
right.
if we're in a situation now where the costs are coming down, businesses are seeing a cost advantage in using renewable energy, and people are getting hit in the face with the actual problems of climate change. Is this something that can rapidly get us in a good direction?
I think it can. I mean, the answer to that is complicated. I think that we have a lot of potential to move quickly in the U.S. China's a funny issue because their emissions seem to be leveling off. On the one hand, they're producing more renewable energy than any other country in the world, which is wonderful. On the other hand, they're still churning out these coal plants just to keep up with the power demand. And then a really thorny issue is India. They're kind of at a crossroads. We'll see where they're going to go in coming years because they've also got to move quickly. They're going to be a very, very important part of this. And then the rest of the world. I mean, you've got less developed countries all over Africa and some other parts of the world. And they all have really highly carbon dependent economies right now. So, that's where the U.S. can be a leader and other, really well-developed nations can be leaders and provide financial incentives and move us all very quickly. But one thing that I actually saw Al Gore talk about, which I thought was really inspiring, was this leapfrogging of technology. And, when you think about, for example, areas of, let's say, really rural areas of Africa where, they never did, put a lot of telephone poles up and run, all kinds of, telephone lines. Well, they just skipped that step altogether and they went right to cell phones. And a similar thing is happening with renewable energy, where rather than building out this elaborate power grid, people are, putting up their own personal solar panels. And so that too, I think is something inspiring because they're finding that they can, move into this higher standard of living without, going through that whole process of urbanizing their power systems.
We'll ask Carl about the upcoming hurricane season in just a moment. But first, this soothing musical Innertube. You can read the report Carl was talking about, issued by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It's at ipcc.ch. And if you'd like to be part of the solution, Carl recommends Project Drawdown, where experts are working on workable solutions to climate change. You can log on to drawdown.org/solutions, and we'll have links to those sites on our webpage. Well, Carl, as we mentioned earlier, we're in the thick of the hurricane season, and so far we've had 8 named hurricanes, including Henri, the one that dumped 8 to 10 inches of rain on most of New York and New England. It seems to me that we have a lot of hurricanes a few of which are very, very severe, and a lot of which just peter out. Am I on the right track with that?
Yeah. So, tropical weather is a really tricky thing. We have a pretty good idea that we are going to see stronger hurricanes in the future, and that they are also going to be slowing down. I was mentioning that earlier. Um, what's tricky is that we don't have a lot of direct evidence of the change that's occurring right now, and that's mostly because we just don't know exactly what happened a very long time ago. For example, when the hurricane hunters first started going up, 60 years ago more, they actually would look out the window and they would look at the condition of the ocean, and from that they would estimate the wind speed of a hurricane. So obviously that's a really crude way of measuring. It was fairly accurate, but relative to the technology that we have today, it was a fairly crude way of measuring the wind speed. So, when you look at the change in technology, the fact that we didn't have satellites up until the 60s, you can't say definitively that we never had really strong or more tropical cyclones before. So that's the detection problem that climate scientists talk about. On the other hand, we do know that all other factors being equal, if you add more energy to the system, if you warm up the water, if you increase the depth of the warmth of the water, you are likely going to see stronger tropical cyclones. And we have seen a lot of, what I would call circumstantial evidence, just remarkable storms that have occurred in recent years. You had Irma, which was for 37 hours at 185 miles per hour, just, staggering. You had Haiyan, which was at 195 miles per hour when it made landfall. You had Patricia, which was at 215 miles per hour. And, that is the benchmark right now. And when you look at the distribution of all of the tropical cyclones in recorded world history based on pressure and wind, you see this enormous, you know, area that starts to thin out as you get higher and higher, and then it finally ends at a certain point, and then Patricia sits well beyond that, and that's what we're talking about when we talk about events that lie outside of the bounds of natural variability. Even though, again, it's difficult to say that definitively in the case of tropical cyclones, we're seeing a lot of really eye-raising events in recent years, and it makes sense. I mean, these storms derive their energy from warm ocean water, so it makes sense that their potential energy would increase when you increase the warmth of the water.
I'm wondering, can you talk again, just in a little bit more detail about what are the mechanisms by which storms are being slowed down? Both Don and I have noticed this, that when we get a nor'easter, and we get a few of them during the winter on the East Coast,
Yeah.
a few of them have sort of gotten parked over our heads.
Yes.
And start bucketing down for 2 to 3 days, which is rather novel.
Yeah.
Because they used to be much faster coming through.
Yeah, in the wintertime, I think there might be some different mechanisms at work. And one of them is a blocking pattern that develops over the North Atlantic. So when you get that block, and there's been some research trying to determine whether or not this is occurring more frequently or not, and whether or not it might be related to less ice in higher latitudes. But when you see that kind of a blocking, that can really park those big storms on the East Coast. I mean, the most spectacular example of that was Hurricane Sandy. And, I don't know, 95 times out of 100, when a big hurricane would get up to that latitude, it would just race out to the northeast and clip the Canadian Maritimes and, go across the Atlantic. Well, what happened in the case of Sandy is you had this huge block that developed in the North Atlantic, and it forced it to the left. And not only did it force it to the left, it created an upper level pattern where there was a lot of lift and evacuation in the upper atmosphere, which actually made the storm even worse. So, that was novel. There were a bunch of us at the time who looked at that and thought, man, that is not something that we have seen a lot of or any of in our careers. And so I think that's part of what happens in the winter. But in terms of the slowing of tropical cyclones or cyclones in general, part of what's happening is what I was mentioning earlier, which is that the jet stream is getting a little weaker because there's not as much temperature contrast. It's feeding off the temperature contrast, and you reduce that, and you reduce the jet stream winds, and the result is that storms don't move as quickly. And in some cases, they'll completely stall out, which is what happened with Harvey.
I guess Fred is the one that's dumping a lot of rain. I heard 8 inches. That's just an astounding amount of water.
Yeah, Fred produced a terrific amount of rain in parts of Northwest Florida. As you mentioned, we saw, a good 7-8 inches, and we're just seeing more of that kind of thing in general. Thankfully, Fred was moving along, but what the recent research has shown is that tropical cyclones, after landfall in North America, have slowed. Their forward speed is slowed by about 21%, and that is related to this change in the jet stream that I was mentioning earlier. And, that really translates to fronts not coming down as early as they used to. And I think we can all relate to that. I mean, it used to be that, there'd be some summers where, by late August and early September, you start really getting that cool blast, and it gets later and later, or maybe you get a little bit, but then the warmth lasts much longer than you thought it would. And so as long as it's warm like that, and you're not getting those cool fronts, well, you don't have as much wind to steer these systems, and that slows them down. And that's a really big part of what is driving the increase in rain, in addition to all the moisture being in the atmosphere, or more moisture being in the atmosphere.
Let's talk about the future. And with all of what we've been talking about today, it doesn't look necessarily that bright. It looks like we're going to have some extreme weather for the near future across most of America. But seriously, what's the outlook? Is it doom and gloom, or is there some light at the end of the tunnel?
Well, I think that it is, and it can be very upsetting. I've got kids, and they're going to be around for a long, long time, and I wonder what they'll go through. And I do think that it is probably going to be wrenching from time to time, and it's going to be difficult. But I do take solace in the fact that we are moving into renewables, but mostly that it's cheaper. I mean, that is just enormous. So you almost have to go out of your way these days to continue to produce dirty fuels, or to, start up with dirty fuels, because it's more expensive. And, they're very entrenched in our political system, and they're, trying to give themselves every advantage. But, I think those advantages are starting to go away. And I think that they're going to be facing more and more legal action, and that's going to make it harder as well. And, the remarkable thing about renewable energy is how much of it there is, how abundant it is. One of my favorite stats is that at least several years ago, the amount of energy that the entire world needed at any moment in time, the constant energy demand was 18 terawatts. A terawatt is a trillion watts. So 18 trillion watts is what everybody needs all the time. And at the top of the atmosphere, the sun gives us 179,000. So I think I see a way out of this. It's incredible how much untapped potential there is in solar, in wind, in water. I mean, it just goes on and on and on. And what's also remarkable about that is when you think about what happened in the late 90s, we had this incredible economic boom because we had an entirely new way of doing things with the internet. And when you have an entirely new way of doing things, that really gets the economy going. And if you're talking about an entirely new way of making energy, of storing it, of transporting it, distributing it, you're talking about a lot of different areas where you need people, you need, new jobs to make that happen. And you're talking about a lot of economic activity. So that's the part that I think gets missed in a lot of this. This is a huge opportunity for us to move into this realm. Not only is it going to make life easier for everybody in the long run, it probably would really juice the economy to do that. There have been a lot of studies that have shown that. And so I think there are just so many good reasons to move in that direction.
Well, hopefully renewable energy and that sort of thing will take us over as rapidly as cell phones did.
Yeah, I hope so.
We'll see a rapid move towards something that's not only affordable, but something that'll be better for the entire globe on a whole. Thanks again for talking with us today, Carl.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
And thank you for listening to the Musical Innertube. Remember, you can read the report issued by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change at ipcc.ch. And to be part of the solution to climate change, go to drawdown.org/solutions. You'll find links to those sites on our webpage. That's musical, spelled with 2 A's, innertube.libsyn.com. And that's also where you'll find all the Innertube interviews, info about our guests, and videos of cats playing pianos. Oh, sorry. The videos of cats playing pianos are on YouTube, but so is the musical Innertube. It's the Innertube on YouTube. Go there and check it out. Also, check us out on Apple, Stitcher, Spotify, SoundCloud, iHeart Podcasts, and Amazon Music. If you'd like to get in touch with us, our email address is musicalinnertube@gmail.com. That's musicalinnertube, all one word. And we're on Twitter @MInnertube. Capitalize the M and the I. Thanks again to Carl Parker of the Weather Channel, and thanks, as always, to the virtual band Car Radio Dog for our theme music.
See, and I think this is really good for our show, Don, because it shows us that we have people who can read on the show. And it's really, I look at a lot of other podcasts and I think, does anybody crack a book, or does anybody ever, read the printed? No, this is very encouraging. Thank you, Carl.
You got it.